Welcome to our 10-minute Shalom Learning Center Lectorium, where we discuss the history of Judaism and Jewish people, which is instrumental in our understanding of the New Testament and beyond the New Testament. And so this is lecture 13, and we are discussing the development of Judaism in the first century BC, and we're talking about Jewish education, the emergence of rabbis as the teachers of the Torah who are not connected with the Levitical priesthood. And that is very important because what we see here, the synagogue and this process of the study of the Torah is not connected with the temple ritual. Even when we talk about Jesus being the temple as described in the Gospels, or the apostles being at the temple as described in the book of Acts, they are not specifically in the sanctuary. They are actually in the Temple Mount, in the area known as the Portico of Solomon, where the makeshift synagogue was. That's where Pharisees taught, because the Sadducees were the priests, and they controlled the temple and sacrifices and everything connected with it. So the Pharisees gained popularity because they provided education. So when in the later first century BC, Judea fell under the Roman control, the Greco-Roman schools were introduced. There were always Hellenistic settlements in Judea. For example, when I take tourists to Israel, we always visit Beit Shean, a huge Hellenistic site, as well as Caesarea, as well as some other places around Galilee. They were populated by Hellenistic population, and there they had Roman schools, which were schools of philosophy, philosophical schools. And if it is philosophy, as we mentioned earlier, they study mathematics, for example. And if it is mathematics, then they can be hired by Roman government to be tax collectors. That's why tax collectors were hated profession in the Gospels by Pharisees, because they were not from the right school. They were from the opposing school, with opposing approach, with a philosophical approach. Whereas the rabbis, they had their own schools. Romans taught applied sciences. They taught philosophy and the applied sciences that allowed people to do some jobs. Rabbis also taught, and they graduated two types of people, scribes and lawyers. We mentioned scribes before. Scribes as instrumental in copying and preserving scripture. But scribes could not feed themselves and their families on doing that. Because, first of all, the system of tithe, according to the Torah, benefited Levites and priests. And so, in order to earn money, these scribes, they were basically functioning as paralegals. How they were taught, and we read many examples in the Talmud, that they were learning different forms, like, let's say, a divorce bill. There is a form. So if a husband wanted to give to his wife a get, which is a bill of divorcement, you go to a scribe, pay scribe money, and the scribe would write in a special form, inserting the name of the husband, the name of the soon-to-be ex-wife, the date, and then the signatures of the witnesses, and that would be officially certified documents. So anything else, wills, bills of sales, you name it, you go to scribe, and scribe knows how to do it. So this is the function of the scribe. They were good at calligraphy. They had to be good at remembering, because there was no website from where you could go to print out the form, and so they had to keep it in their memory. The lawyers, that's a different type of profession, and the lawyer means lawyer. It's just person who knows how to offer a legal help. For example, there was a lawyer by the name Zenos mentioned in the epistle to Titus. And so lawyers did all kinds of things for people, representing them in the different court cases. So that's what the lawyer would feed himself and his family. And of course, on Shabbat, he would be, as a Pharisee, a teacher and a commentator on the Torah. As we see in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 23, Jesus mentions so-called the seat of Moses. And the seat of Moses, that's where a rabbi, a Pharisee, would sit, and after the Torah portion is read, he would provide a commentary, an explanation of this Torah portion. But that was a Sabbath activity. That was divine service activity. But during the work days, they did all kinds of all kinds of legal activity, and there was quite a few legal issues among the people. For example, interestingly enough, the Gospel of Luke mentions the story of a certain man who, in chapter 12, asks Jesus to tell his brother to divide properly his inheritance. When we look, of course, this man wasn't just about telling Jesus or expecting that Jesus would call upon his brother and say, "Hey, sir, I'm telling you to give your brother his portion of inheritance." That wasn't the case. What this man was asking, he was asking Jesus to be his legal representative in the court case where the issue of the dispute for the inheritance would be decided. Jesus politely refused to do this and told his disciples clearly that he's not teaching them to be lawyers. in these rabbinic schools, there was a group of talented students, the disciples, who themselves would acquire disciples. For example, Rabbi Akiva, who was one of the famous rabbis of the rabbinic period, end of the first, beginning of the second century, about him we have the following statement in his history, in the story, that after studying yeshiva, he acquired 400 disciples. So, this kind of best of the best, the cream of the crops, the best of lawyers and the scribes, they become themselves the successors of their rabbis, and by actually attracting more disciples to themselves. It is interesting that Jesus was the rabbi, but he wasn't preparing professional lawyers. He was preparing professional rabbis. His last words were, "Go and make disciples." So that's kind of an interesting parallel, which we can see when we understand the concept of discipleship as it was in early Judaism.